How many characters do you need to know to be able to read Chinese? The truth is that characters only provide a foundation, so regardless of how many you know, you won't be able to read much unless you also know many words. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to continue our discussion of the building blocks of Chinese. And in previous episodes, we have already talked about how Chinese characters work, how they are made up of components, how those components work, and how they fit together to form characters. If you want to catch up on that, I suggest you check out episode 54, 55, 62, and 63. Of course, you can also head over to Hacking Chinese and simply search for building blocks and you will find all these articles. And since this series is about the written language, the building blocks of the written language, it sometimes makes more sense to see these things written down, and all these episodes have articles that they are based on. On the podcast, I of course do my best to make these things understandable in a spoken format, but if you check the description, you will be able to find links to the written articles if you prefer to read about these things instead, or, well, at the same time, if you prefer. So in this week's episode, and in next week's episode too, we are going to talk about words. And it might not be immediately apparent to you what the difference is between a Chinese word and a Chinese character, so that is something we are going to explore today, along with why this matters to you as a learner. So one of the most common questions that beginners ask about reading in Chinese, and this question can sometimes also come from people who haven't learned Chinese at all, but they know that there are characters, and that is, how many characters do you need to be able to read in Chinese? Or sometimes people ask, how many characters are there in total? I would say that both these questions are built on a misunderstanding of how the Chinese writing system works, because it's simply not the case that if you know a certain number of characters, you will be able to read a certain kind of text. That's simply not how it works. Characters will provide you a foundation, but it's actually words that are used to convey meaning. And words can consist of one character, two characters, or more. And sometimes it is rather obvious how these are combined, but often it is not. So simply knowing characters, even if you know, say, 6,000 of them, is not really what will enable you to read a text. It does provide a good foundation, but it is not enough. So in this first episode about words, we're going to explore why this is the case. We're going to talk a little bit about what a word is, what a phrase is, what a character is, and what the relationship is between these things, and why this matters to you as a learner. We're also going to talk about some other fundamental things regarding words in Chinese, and then in the next episode we are going to talk about compound words and how those work in more detail. So let's start from the simplest words, which consist of a single character. And these are words where the character can be used on its own to mean something. And this is most frequent when it comes to everyday language. And if you think about it, many of the verbs, very common verbs, use only a single character. So for example, we have kan, to see, we have 吃, to eat, 喝, to drink, 给, to give, and 走, to walk. And all these are single syllables and single character words. They can be used as is as independent words here. And if you flip through your textbook, especially if you're a beginner, you will see many of these single character words. If you take a slightly more advanced textbook though and flip through the word list in that, or even if you take a word dictionary, you will see that most words are actually not single characters. They are two characters. And this is indeed the norm in Chinese. Most words have two characters, and there's a very strong preference for two-syllable words in the spoken language as well. And this means that we can't really use single characters as a basis, but as I will try to demonstrate today, knowing about the individual characters and their meanings makes it much easier to learn the word, how it's used, and what it means. Sometimes this connection is very obvious, so as long as you know the individual characters, you will be able to make sense of the word. In other cases, it's not that easy. So let's look at three examples here. And the first one is 足球, which means football, or soccer if you're an American. And 足 here means foot, and 球 means ball. So this is not rocket science. You can figure out that foot plus ball means football. Example number two is slightly more tricky. 跳舞 means to dance, and it consists of the characters jump and dance. And while this doesn't make sense in English, you can at least see that there is some sense to this. You can imagine that there is a language where people say jump dance instead of just dance, and indeed that's what we do in Chinese. But then we get to the third example, which is 东西, which consists of two characters, 东 east and 西 west. And this means thing or stuff. And this has no relationship at all with the individual characters, so you would never be able to guess this unless you know what it meant in advance. I should also point out here that 东西, with the first tone on the second syllable as well, actually does mean east-west and can be used as such too, but here it's 东西with a neutral tone on si, and that means thing or stuff. So even if it's not always apparent why certain characters are combined to form a word, by knowing the characters you are at least using something that is meaningful to learn something new, and that is very helpful. Otherwise what you're doing is learning random combinations of jumbles of strokes, and this is just unnecessarily hard. So far, we have seen that most Chinese words can be broken down into meaningful components, i.e. individual characters, even if the compound itself might not always make sense to us as non-native speakers. But this raises a question. What is the difference between a word and a character? If we can break down 东西 into east and west, and these are in themselves words, does that mean that 东西, the word, is composed of smaller words? And then what is the difference between a character and a word, for example? If you haven't studied Chinese linguistics, you might be surprised to hear that this is actually a very complicated topic, and it's something that people write books and theses about. In English, it is easier at least to figure out what a word is, because, for example, we have spacing around words in the written language, which makes it easier to identify what is a word and what isn't. We also have lots of inflections that we use on words, which means that they are also easier to identify in the spoken language. In Chinese, though, you might have noticed that in the written language we don't have any spaces at all, which is indeed a major hurdle if you are new to reading Chinese. You need to figure out where one word ends and where the next begins. The spoken language doesn't use inflections the way English does either, which further complicates identifying what a word actually is. And this is something which is quite easy to see if we look back in history, because the concept of a word is actually quite new in Chinese. So if we look at dictionaries, traditionally we're talking about 字典, so that's character dictionaries, and these only list single characters and what they mean and how they are used and so on and so forth. And it's only in the 20th century that we start having 词典, so that would be word dictionaries. And those are the dictionaries that we normally associate with learning Chinese today, but this is, like I said, a relatively new phenomenon. So to show you why this might be tricky, let's have a look at some things you might think of as words and see where we draw the line. What is a word? And for instance, what is a phrase? So, 你好, is that a word? I mean, it's a common greeting, and if you think about it in English, it certainly looks like a word. Hello is certainly a word, and then you might think, okay, 你好, it's probably also a word, right? It has two characters too, so it's probably a word. But what about the even more polite way of saying hello then, 您好? Is that also a word? But then what about things like 你们好? If we add a plural marker here, 你们好, is that also a word? And if we say 大家好, if we say hello to everybody or everybody present, is that also a word? What about something like 老师好 if you say hello to your teacher? Or maybe in the morning when you meet someone and say 早上好, is that also a word? It seems like you take something and append how to it at the end. It seems odd that all these would be words, and indeed they aren't. So if you look in a word dictionary, none of these, including 你好, are actually listed as words. They don't exist in a dictionary because they are treated as phrases. And another way of saying that is that we need to look at the individual characters as units that can be manipulated inside of these phrases, not as an indivisible unit as a word. So to pin down what a word could be in Chinese, let's look at 4 more examples. And the first one is 大衣, which literally means big clothes. And then we have 大家, which means big home or big family maybe. And then we have 大树, which is big plus tree. And then we have 大桥, which means big plus bridge. And I've deliberately not given any extra meanings of these here because I want to talk about if they are words or not before I do that. And here we can see how wordhood in Chinese really works. Because if the meaning of two characters that appear next to each other is simply a direct addition of those two characters, it is usually not a word. So for example, 大树 here means big tree, and it literally just means big plus tree. It has no extra special meaning, it just means the meaning of those two characters combined. And the same is true for 大桥. This just means big bridge, there is no additional meaning here. But if we look at words like 大衣 and 大家, that is not the case. 大衣 doesn't just mean a big piece of clothing, it means overcoat specifically. And 大家 doesn't mean big family or big home, it means everybody. So it has a meaning beyond the component characters. And these two, 大一 and 大家, are treated as words, whereas 大树 and 大乔 are not words, they are simply phrases. So if you have a compound like this, where you have an adjective and then a noun after it, one way you can check if it is a word is by inserting the in the middle. Because if you can insert the, it's most likely a phrase. Because, for example, you can say 大的树 to mean the big tree, and you can say 大的桥, that also works for big bridge. But you can't say 大的衣, it simply doesn't work, it doesn't mean overcoat. And you can't say 大的家 to mean everybody. That simply means something else, or it's not used at all, which means that these are words if you are unable to insert that. Now, if you're a beginner, this doesn't work because you cannot feel or hear if you actually can insert this the here. But for more advanced learners or maybe native speakers who happen to be listening, this is one of the ways you can figure out if it is a word or not. And I don't want to go too deeply into this because it is quite a complicated topic, but I do suggest that you check out chapter 5 in Duan Musan's The Phonology of Standard Chinese if you are interested in getting an overview of various ways of defining what a word is in Chinese. So what about the rest of you who maybe might not be so interested in the linguistic aspects of these things? Can't we just leave these problems to linguists to figure out and bicker about? Well, yes, you can actually, and there is a shortcut to figuring out what a word is if you really want to. You just take an authoritative dictionary such as 现代汉语词典, and you check if the thing you want to look up is in there, and if it is a word, and if it isn't, it is a phrase. Of course, there might be edge cases where people can argue that something is a word or something isn't a word, but in this case, someone has already done the analysis for you because they are not including phrases in these dictionaries. For example, if you look up all the 你好, 您好, and all the other cases that I said weren't words above, none of these appear in the dictionary. But that's not the end of it, and there are certain things we can't just leave to linguists to write papers about and go to conferences and have arguments over. And one such example is what's sometimes called separable words or separable verbs. And in Chinese, this is 离合词. And this refers to words such as 吃饭. And if you think about what we talked about earlier about phrases, it seems like 吃饭 actually could be a phrase, right? It looks like a verb-object compound, to eat rice. And isn't that a phrase then? But then again, if you look this word up, because it is a word, in a dictionary you will find it there, and it is listed as a word, not a phrase. They are usually indicated by having two slashes between the syllables. So, for example, 吃饭 would be written as 吃//饭. And this indicates that they can be, and indeed sometimes must be, separated when used in a phrase or in a sentence. So to make sure we have a few examples to talk about, let's revive an old one. So we have 吃饭, of course, we just said that. And then I mentioned 跳舞 before. That's also one of these separable verbs. And it's 跳 is the verb here, and it's to jump a dance or to jump dance, right? And then the third one I want to use is 睡觉. It's a bit tricky in English because sleep can of course be a verb and a noun, and it sounds and looks the same. But to sleep asleep or to sleep sleep. So if you are a beginner, it's likely that you treat these as words. You think that 吃饭 means to eat, and that 跳舞 means to dance, and that 睡觉 means to sleep. And indeed, that's what they mean, but this is not how they are used. And I'm not saying that you should learn all the individual characters of every single word you learn immediately all the time. I'm just saying that in Chinese, you cannot treat words just as words. You need to look at the individual characters. So let's look at 3 different ways of using these words that are very unintuitive to most beginners, and sometimes also to advanced speakers, to be honest. So the first example is that if you want to use the experiential marker 过, you have to say 吃过饭. You cannot say 吃饭过. So if you simply treat 吃饭 as meaning eat, and then you think you can apply 过, and you do that at the end, you will be wrong. You have to understand that 吃 is the verb here, and 饭 is a noun. So you have to put the 过 after the verb, and hence you get 吃过饭. And then if you want to say that you are unable to sleep, you must say 睡不了觉. You cannot say 睡觉不了. But again, as a beginner, if you think of 睡觉 as a unit that means to sleep, it feels most intuitive to add 不了 at the end. But you can't do that. You have to insert it between the verb and the object here. And finally, if you want to say that someone begins or starts to dance, you need to say 跳起舞来. You cannot just say 跳舞起来 and then append 起来 at the end, as you can with some other verbs. So I bring this up here because I want to show that it's important to understand the internal structure of words. So for this group of words, which is quite big and important, we do have this structure of verb plus object. And if you're going to modify this in some way that affects the verb, you need to do that after the verb, not after the whole word. As usual, when it comes to languages, sometimes these things are very regular and easy to follow in most cases, but then there are these weird ones that just don't behave as you expect them to. So, for example, just to mention one, we have the word guanxin, which means to concern or be concerned about something. So it's guan, close, and then we have heart, xin. And you might think that this is a separable verb, but it actually isn't, and it is not listed as such in the dictionary either. And so you can't say guan le xin, for example. You have to say guan xin le, even though it certainly looks like it is a verb-object compound. And then, as if the Chinese language kind of tried to deliberately troll us as second language learners, you can actually separate it in other cases. So you can, for example, say guan sheme xin and insert sheme between guan and xin. So even if you can learn about these things and it helps you understand the language, you will never be able to understand or figure everything out simply by studying theory. I'm just bringing these things up because, at least for me, these things help me enormously when it comes to understanding how words work and why people say things the way they do and why a certain word is written the way it is, and so on. But there will always be these exceptions, and my advice is just to ignore these cases unless they turn out to be numerous. In that case, they maybe aren't exceptions, and you should look into what's actually going on. But just because you find a single example that doesn't work the way you think it would, don't tear your hair and break down or quit learning Chinese or something like that. Just ignore it. So we're approaching the end of this episode, but I want to bring up two things before we round things off. And the first is that word length in Chinese can be rather flexible, and this is a very peculiar phenomenon in Chinese that we don't see in English. So for example, many of these two-character words that we've been talking about, they often, or indeed most of the time, have single-syllable counterparts that mean exactly the same thing, even though they can sometimes be used slightly differently. So for example, we have the word shangdian, which means shop. But we also have the word dian, that also means shop on its own and can be used like that. We have da suan, that means garlic, but we then can also say garlic by saying just suan. And we can say zhongzhi, to plant, but we can also just say zhong. And most of the time these are used roughly the same way and they mean the same thing. Figuring out exactly how these are used and the difference between them can be very difficult, and it's also something that is related to rhythm, that in some sentences or in some situations a two-syllable word is preferred, whereas in some cases a single-syllable word is preferred. And this is, again, not something you can read about and then understand how it works and then just start using these words perfectly, but it is something that can be rather interesting, and I've referred to the phonology of Standard Chinese already in this episode, and there is more about this in Chapter 7 for those who are interested. For the rest of you, I suggest what I normally suggest when it comes to figuring out how things work in Chinese. Simply read and listen more, because if you do, you will build up a feel for how the words are used, and even if you might not get it right all the time, you will get it right often enough, and increasingly often at that. The second and final thing I want to bring up before we round this off is the origin of words. And this is sometimes important to know about, or at least to be aware of, because it can explain some words that otherwise would be incomprehensible. So let's quickly go through 7 different origins for words that are used in mainstream Chinese. And this list is from Shao Jingmin, 2007, although the translations are my own. So the first words are inherited words, and those are words that simply have come down through the ages and originated maybe somewhere else sometime in the distant past, but it doesn't really matter because they've been in Chinese for so long. And here we have very common words such as ren, person, shan, mountain, tiankong, sky, and tudi, land. Category number 2 is ancient words, and these are words that have a specific reference in a certain time period and might only be used when referring to that or with something related to that era. So for example, a word like 陛下, which means Your Majesty, is for obvious reasons not very commonly used in modern Chinese, but it is used and then it refers back to an older time. Group number 3 consists of topolect or dialect words, and these are words that have entered Mandarin from some other dialect. And this is rather common, and we have some examples from Cantonese here. So for example, 打工, which means to work for others or to work part-time. And we have 炒鱿鱼, which means literally to fry squid, but is also used to mean to get fired. Group number 4 consists of community words, so those might have their origin in a specific community. For example, people who worked in Beijing but weren't from Beijing themselves refer to this group of people as Beipiao, and this is a word that is then used in the mainstream language because other people started using this to refer to this group, and then they used other, not just Bei as in Beijing, but also other cities. So this is then a word that entered the language this way. We have a local one here in Sweden, for example, where Chinese people call Stockholm Sijing, and the official name for Stockholm is Sydgörmo, which is a mouthful to say and not very pretty, to be honest. And most Chinese people here in Sweden simply call it Sijing. And if this word were to enter the mainstream language, then this would also then be a community word. Number 5 is professional words, and this is a set of words that have started out in one area, a professional area, and then have entered the language in a broader sense. So a good example might be taolao, which means to be stuck with something, and originally it means to be stuck with a bad investment. So you invest money into something, and then the stocks go down, and you can't really sell because you lose a lot of money, and then you're stuck there. And then we have this taolao. And this can nowadays be used for other things as well. So it's entered the mainstream language, so you can, for example, be trapped maybe in a bad marriage or something like that. And then you can also use taolao. Category number 6 contains foreign words, and this is maybe the most important one to be aware of, because if you don't know that something is a loan word, it might be very difficult to understand. So for example, we have cafe, that means coffee, and if you try to analyze the characters here, they won't help you, because this is simply a phonetic translation or transliteration of the word coffee. It could also be a mix between sound and meaning. So for example, New Zealand in Chinese is Sinsilan, and Sin here obviously is a translation of new, and Silan here is Zealand. So it's a mix of meaning and sound. And then you can also mix sound and meaning in the other way. So you have a Chinese word and then use a foreign prefix. So pijiu, for example. Jiu here is obviously a Chinese word that means alcohol, but pi doesn't make sense on its own here. The meaning of that character has nothing to do with this. You need to know that it comes from English or maybe from German to make sense of the word. We also have words that have both meaning and sound at the same time, such as jiin, which means gene. So it sounds like gene, and the characters also mean something that is related to gene. So ji means basic here, and in maybe means element. And then, of course, we also have words that are just used straight off in Chinese, such as OK or DVD or something like that, but those rarely cause trouble for us, of course, provided that you know the source word. The 7th and final category are new words, because of course there are new things in China and therefore we also need new words for them. And this happens in all areas. So we have, for example, from economy, we have words like 国企, which means state-owned enterprise, or from technology, maybe 电脑, computer, or something from daily life, such as 方便面, which means instant noodles. These words are often easy to understand because the composition is pretty obvious, because it was also created in a modern context that is often easier to understand. Regular listeners to the podcast might recall that in episode 44 we talked about names and transliteration of names and how that can sometimes cause trouble. So for example, Iceland is Bingdao, so ice island literally, so relying on the meaning of the original word. But then we have Greenland, which looks superficially the same in English, but it's actually called Gelingland in Chinese, which is purely a translation of the sound. Of course, knowing English is often not enough here, because some names in Chinese don't make sense unless you also know some other language. And one example I remember from reading lots of news when I started learning Chinese is the Chinese name for the radio station Al Jazeera, and this is in Arabic, and I can't speak Arabic, so I apologize if I mangle the pronunciation there. But in Chinese it's called Bandao Dianshitai. So Bandao means peninsula or half island, peninsula. And this doesn't make much sense unless you know Arabic, because in Arabic the station's name means the island and it refers to the Arabian Peninsula, and that is indeed a Bandao Peninsula, right? So that's why it's called Bandao Dianshitai in Chinese. And this makes zero sense unless you know that. When it comes to Japanese names, we usually keep the same characters in Chinese, even though they are pronounced completely differently. So the capital is called Tokyo, of course, but in Chinese it's Dongjing, and they are written the same way in Japanese and Chinese, but obviously pronounced completely differently. So if this sounds interesting, I refer to episode 44, where we talked about this a lot more. But Japanese is particularly interesting as a source of new words in Chinese because there are many words that feel very Chinese but actually come from Japanese. And this is because a lot of words were imported from Japanese before China modernized, and when China modernized, these words already existed in Japanese and they were often borrowed over. So some examples here are 杂志 magazine, 电话 for telephone, and 革命 for revolution, for example. If you want to read more about that, I included several links in the article on Hacking Chinese. Okay, I feel that we have talked enough about words for now at least, and the point here was that by understanding the structure of words and by understanding roughly how words work in Chinese, we can learn them more effectively. And the most important lesson is that you do need to understand that words are often composed of smaller components, the characters, and by understanding those, you can also make sense of the words, and that also makes them easier to learn. In next week's episode, we're going to continue this discussion with more examples. We're going to look at different kinds of compounds and how you can use the knowledge of these compounds to learn more words and to remember them longer. So, for example, if you wonder why 老虎 is old tiger in Chinese, or what the 字 is doing at the end of many nouns such as 桌子 or 椅子, or maybe if you are confusing the order of certain words and sometimes maybe say 蜜蜂 bee instead of 蜂蜜 honey, then stay tuned for next week's episode. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.